Brilliant. Thanks everyone for joining us this lunchtime. So I'd like to welcome you all. So obviously this session is around reuse, how to measure the data around reuse, and really the process from design stage all the way through to implementation and results. And I've got with me two amazing panelists. We've got Anne Beavis, she's Head of Sustainability Development for Crown Workplace. So to give you a bit of background on Anne, she's played a role in setting up sustainable and circular economy services for Crown Workplace, developing pretty much everything, environment, social and economic solutions around reuse and refurbishment of office furniture and IT equipment. She also sits on the BSI subcommittee, developing new standards for refurb and remanufacturing of office furniture. And she actually leads Crown's relationship with Herman Miller as an authorised refurbishment partner status. She sits on many committees, and she also co-authored the IWFM Good Practice Guide on Recycling, Waste and Resource Management, and is on the Business and the Community Circular Economy Task Force. So I'm sure you'll hear lots of things about her experiences. And we've got Jack Millard, who is Senior Sustainability Consultant for Twin and Earth, and he's had over 6 years experience working in the sustainability sector. And Jack actually has a very deep understanding of sustainability within the built environment. And he's particularly involved and interested in material aspects of building design. He also is part of the UK GBC's working group around circular economy and focuses on developing metrics needed to deliver the circular economy. So what we really wanted to get out of this session, it was almost like a clinic, if you like. So really, we're going to be asking Jack and Anne to explain the processes and stages of how they go about initiating and implementing reuse from the planning stage, design, build, fit out, if you like, and kind of post results, and how they use that data for tendering processes. I'd also like them to explain a little bit about the enablers and challenges of going through that. And from an audience perspective, I'd love you to submit any current challenges you have around implementing reuse while we're talking in the session, and obviously any other questions you'd like. So we'll keep the conversation to around 25 minutes, and I'll give 15 minutes at the end for Q&As, but please guys, feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A section, and I'll pick them up as we go along. So I'll come to you, Jack, first, actually. Could you explain a little bit, obviously, your role, but from the initial stages of kind of a project side, how do you go about thinking about reuse, and you know, what do you say to clients, or how do you look at projects, basically? So I'll pass it straight to you.
Yeah. So yeah, as May mentioned, I'm a senior sustainability consultant at Twin and Earth. We're an energy and sustainability consultancy. So typically clients will appoint us to help them define their sustainability strategies on their projects. So what that means is, you know, at the very early stages, stage 0, stage 1, we will help develop the project's brief, but more particularly the sustainability brief. And at that stage, I think it's really crucial in sort of facilitating reuse practices. And that's because you're trying to develop the aspirations for a project. And at that point is when you can be a bit more emotive about the reasonings behind, you know, reuse. You know, from my perspective, certainly, why am I trying to promote reuse? Is because, you know, fundamentally, the most greenest buildings are those that already exist. And also having to eliminate the need for new materials obviously has an impact on your building's embodied carbon. So with that sort of context in mind, you know, we're trying to drive change. And when you're talking about driving change, you're trying to be a bit more emotive, a bit more inspirational. So having that context at the upfront piece where clients are a bit more open to sort of doing things a little bit differently if you take them on that journey. So at that stage 0, stage 1 period is really critical in trying to get the client to think a little bigger, and that's where I think in the past we've had successes in trying to set the objectives early, in that, you know, this is what we want to try and achieve.
Yeah.
So going from the aspirations through to action, then you're going from REBA stages 0 to 1 through to stage 2. That's when you're really thinking about, you know, what we can actually do in terms of reuse. And there are some enablers, there are some drivers for this within the construction industry. So if you have a major planning application, for example, within London, the GLA are requiring new projects, major applications to submit a circular economy statement. And as part of that, they really have a hierarchy of reuse. So there is a circular economy decision tree within the GLA circular economy guidance, which is pretty much best practice. And the first step of that decision tree is, can the building be reused and refurbished? If not, are there elements within that can be reused either on-site, off-site? Again, if not, what can you do to maximize the residual value of those materials? So it is trying to be a bit systematic about the asset that you already have and how you can best recover the materials within that asset. So I think that's probably the most recent key driver, and that requirement has come out sort of the beginning of this year. So new planning applications which are GLA referable will need to provide that narrative to the GLA, and it will be scrutinized. So there's expectations, for example, for projects to undertake pre-demolition audits, and that requirement, the pre-demolition audit requirement, gives project teams the ability to have more information about their buildings, and then with that information, they can make more informed decisions about what they're doing in terms of their design and construction. Can we utilize elements within the building already to for other parts of the building? So I think that's a really useful mechanism to drive reuse within the construction industry. And I think prior to this, there's not really been any legislative drivers. So that's a big step, and I imagine that the GLA's requirements and other planning authorities will sort of drive that forward over future applications. So I suppose that's sort of at the concept design stage. When you're thinking about the project in terms of its aspirations and what you're trying to achieve. Beyond that, going into actual sort of the design of the building, it really is about engagement. Engagement with other stakeholders. So getting demolition contractors, strip out contractors involved in the conversation early. So, for example, we've worked on a project recently. It's pre-planning, and we've set out the requirements for the strip out contractor to ensure that they undertake a pre-demolition audit, to ensure that they sort of advise the design team on how best to utilize any existing materials once they come on board.
Sorry to cut you off then. How do you communicate that to them? So obviously they're reading it and they're wondering, like, well, what is it?
Yeah.
They might not know any solutions or anything. How do you go about changing their behavior or engaging them in that process?
So I think the first step is that you really do need client buy-in. So there are some barriers to deconstruction. The primary barriers are time and cost. So it is more labor intensive to deconstruct projects, particularly if the building itself doesn't easily allow for that. So if it was designed for disassembly, it's obviously a little bit more easy to disassemble the building. But really, you do need that client buying or understanding of a bit more of a longer term approach, whereby if you can recover the materials and potentially in future sell those materials on, is there a cost benefit for the client there? And it's rather than having the sort of demolition contractors contract set up in such a way that they just focus on cost and program, which is what it's currently set up as, to have a little bit more of a whole life approach to it, whereby if you're gonna be able to disassemble the materials and reuse those in the project, that just needs to be thought about at that point, really.
Yeah, I've got a very quick poll actually before Anne gives us her view on it. Just on the back of that, I'm just going to launch it now, and it's basically, what are the main barriers for you to implement reuse? So obviously we've kept it very basic, but I'm going to leave it up for probably another couple of probably about 10 seconds, just to see the guys, the audience on the line, what the barriers are for them. And while we're just doing that, and maybe from your perspective, you kind of come in at that stage with Crown and your personal experience. What would you say at that kind of planning and design stage is beneficial for you? What are the challenges and what are the enablers? I'm going to end the poll now, so we can let everyone share the results. It's a lot of it. See, you can see 53% too much time and labor intensive. and lack of understanding of support. So that's actually quite interesting. Whereas probably a few years ago, people may have thought it was probably too expensive. So it just shows the interesting of the shift in what the new barriers are all about. So I'll let you carry on with that.
I'm really pleased to see those results made, because they reflect what I'm seeing and hearing now. In my role as Crown Workspace, you're right, I'm largely involved in the reuse and refurbishment of office furniture and IT, but also because of the fit out work, some of the internal infrastructure from fit out projects. But I've obviously worked and seen reuse operating in sort of build environments as well across the years. And I think, to build on what Jack said, in terms of setting aspirations and working on emotions and emotive reasons for change, that's really important. But I think now actually helping people deliver that change is something that's becoming increasingly important. I think sometimes it's been, there's been almost academic exercises of setting out, we would like these targets reached, we'd like these aspirations reached. But actually, if your supply chain don't have the skills, the knowledge, the staff to understand it, they will either just take a tick box approach and say something's being done, and then try and and try and see what they can do, but not really be progressive. Whereas if you look at more of a working partnership and say, okay, what is it about these aspirations that you don't understand? What is it that your team need to know? Where are the skills barriers? Where are the connection barriers? Where are the knowledge barriers? Show me another project where it was done. How did they approach it? And I think the speed and acceleration that we need to facilitate reuse has to be about sharing and learning knowledge. So I think at this stage, at the planning or the designing stage, really, it's that having very honest discussions. So you want to achieve reuse. Okay, so what does that look like? What does it mean from a specification perspective? And what does it mean for the barriers what are the barriers? It's been great to see those ones there, because I do think skills, knowledge, and knowing what's achievable in the supply chain and working with it will be, is a massive area to overcome. And it's great results to reflect that.
And we just got a question actually from Gerard saying, but basically too much time, obviously it's too much time, and labour is also expensive. How would you go about with that objection? Because obviously that's one that there's an assumption in the market. So some contractors will say, it's expensive if I'm stripping it out carefully compared to obviously smashing it up or just not having the time. And obviously in the past, contractors do many things and project managers do many things. So it's like, how do you go about changing that mindset, but also looking at the cost implications? And have you seen a big difference in the cost from experience? And that goes out to both Jack and Anne on the costing.
I can jump in first on my side, which is more about the infrastructure. I would agree that that's been the common theme. It takes too long. There's more staff involved, and it's more costly. As more and more solutions come to market, technologies enabled reuse, as there's more and more innovation, I do think there's improvements in those areas. So as an example, just in terms of what the side on the furniture, when we set up, historically, when people were clearing buildings, they would take out 100 pieces of furniture, pretty much throw them in the skip, put it outside and take it away, because that was deemed to be easiest. And when we set up the business model for resale, donation and reuse, projects took a couple of days longer and took more manpower, and that didn't necessarily make sense. But when we were able to show the economic value, as in by segregating materials on site, this is the rebates you can get, this is the cost reduction you can get. Now that there are more, let's say, social value targets relating to contracts or aspirations around those parts, being able to demonstrate what can be achieved from there, and actually looking at the assets as values, looking at them as parts that can be reused in some way. So obviously, because we've now got the office furniture remanufacturing and refurbishment, what was once considered a waste and people paying hundreds of pounds a tonne to get rid of is now an asset. Now, I appreciate when we haven't got that level of sophistication in for every construction material, but we're getting there. It's the same with carpet tiles, ceiling tiles. They're not items of waste, but yes, it does take more. But that's why the mindset is where you start, because if the mindset is this is too hard to do, then it will be.
Yeah. And Jack, what are your thoughts on that? And also, obviously, you've worked a lot on metrics and obviously designing standards. How does that kind of complement, or maybe not, on what you're doing there?
Yeah, I think as Anne said there, there's a different scope to reuse. So there's some elements which would naturally align better to be able to be reused. So they're more easily to strip out, for example, carpet tiles, ceiling tiles, etc. At the moment, they're probably the easiest to reuse elsewhere, the sort of soft strips side of things. In terms of the more large-scale reuse and refurbishment or disassembly, there are significant challenges to that, and fundamentally, we've had feedback from demolition contractors that the disassembly side of things will naturally be more labor-intensive and more costly. So unless the client has bigger ambitions than just what they need to do from a legislation point of view, they're not going to pursue that route. Yeah, so there are some barriers to that in the sense that we need some policy drivers that are going to change that approach, and that's not going to happen. Essentially, reuse won't happen for those sorts of clients unless there is an external driver. For those that are a bit more aspirational in what they want to achieve, there's for example, Grosvenor have recently undertaken a bit of a material reuse study. So some of you may be aware they've sort of recently set out some webinars about the experiences they've had on one of their projects. So for those of you who don't know, they've undertaken a bit of a research piece on how you actually go about reuse of an existing asset. Teaming up with Elliott Wood, Orms and Arup, for example, they have set out a number of very useful guides on their experience. They do set out some of the barriers being policy, time, costs. But in terms of their lessons learned, I think it goes back to what Anne said there about really you just got to go through the process and see what you can do. You've got to just do it. You've got to pick it up and go with it. If there are barriers that are too expensive for the client to bear, then there's not a lot you can do about that at this point. But going through the process, you may find that actually there is something you can salvage, and it will have a benefit from it potentially have an economic benefit, an environmental benefit, and a social benefit. So from my perspective, it's worth doing.
Yeah, maybe not doing everything at once, right? Doing very low risk, compliant, safe materials first, and then build your way up to the materials that need kind of verification and testing and so on. And yeah, I agree. The Elliott Woods, when the report they've done with Grosvenor on the processes, they've got actually very good diagrams in one of their reports on how to actually implement it, which could be very useful for people as well. We have a question from Nicholas. Embodied carbon should be driving building material reuse. The barrier is warranty and liability for extending the design life. Does the panel have experience on extending existing structures? View on, and then it says I, but I think you have view on it.
That was accidental. I don't have any personal experience on that, but I've been told by sort of structural engineers that basically you just need to take some of those people along with you on the journey. So you need to speak to. There are sort of insurance companies that have experience with reusing. With using reused materials, so you just need to make sure that you look at those types of people. There are companies out there, for example, Cleveland Steel and Tubes. They stock reused steel, and they certify it. Test and certify those products. So there are lessons to be learned from people, and you just need to have a bit more of a collaborative approach. Like, for example, I was tendering with a contractor, and they had basically no experience of using reused steel. And by the end of it, a couple of weeks later, having coordinated with Cleveland Steel and Tubes, they were fully on board and they fully understood the process. So it is about just engaging with people that have that experience, in terms of whether it's a manufacturer, whether it is insurers, but just trying to identify those people that can take you along with the journey with you.
Yeah, and I think one of our clients in the past has made a bit of effort and called up the manufacturer of a particular lighting that was in an old building. And he thought it was a bit of that. They said it was a phone call and an email, and the manufacturer accepted it back and refurbed it and tested it for them, and they were able to use it in the building. But that was someone taking their initiative a little bit off, of the beaten track. But and I mean, you've had a lot of it. You've done a lot of repairing, and your experience probably with Herman Miller as well with the chairs is quite a good example of, I suppose, a luxury product. Herman Miller's quite high end. So I think you've probably got some experience there to answer that as well.
I mean, there is movement. I mean, I certainly know from the work we've done as the Business and Community Task Force that at a very high level, some, the big material manufacturers in construction are looking at this, because they're looking at it from the front end, and they're looking at what they're putting in now into the construction process. How can that be classified and coded so that when it is deconstructed, this is a lot easier? But to learn about how to design into reuse, you can really only learn that by looking at what's coming out now and what the challenges that presents. And whilst it's much easier to do that, without a doubt, with a Herman Miller office chair than it is with building materials, the actual principles are the same, because it is a supply chain issue, it's a collaboration issue, and it's a challenging the economic norms. So when we've got office furniture, we have to put it back out again with a warranty. And to do that, we have to carry out checks and balances and refurbishments. But we didn't make the chair in the first place. So as a refurbisher or remanufacturer, we can only do so much. But Herman Miller recognised that they put out new products into the marketplace, and actually they've got a responsibility as a producer to be able to provide, the best second life options for that possible. So, it's an economic challenge for them, because by supporting the refurbishment and by endorsing that remanufacturing and refurbishment process, in effect, you could say it could impact their supply of new. But progressive manufacturers know that they have to be sustainable in what they create and take a responsibility for what they've already created. So by starting to look to your main material supplies, if you're involved in the construction process, the materials that are going in, the materials that are going out. Years ago, I was involved in setting up take back from plasterboard a long time ago, and the reason that was done was because there was going to be legislation around it if the manufacturers didn't take responsibility for it. So it's in everyone's interest for this to happen. There has to be some very open and honest dialogue, and the commercials have to stack up, which is why it takes a certain sort of working. But the partnership approach of Herman Miller shows that you can bring that collaboration between different people in the chain. The reusers, the specifiers, the designers, it has a whole process, but that's how you then achieve that shift and it makes it practical to actually implement.
We've got some good questions coming up. I think it's Eva. Hi, great stuff she's put. I'm just wondering how do we work with changing this common mindset of reuse being too inconvenient? Has anyone had any experience with this?
I think it just goes back to that point of you've just got to start the process. You've got to have it as an aspiration and try to follow through with it. If it is too inconvenient, that's a problem, and you just have to identify at that point. But I think unless you do it, we're not all reuse experts. You just need to start to try and go through the process, and just simple things like having the conversation with the client. That's a good starting point. This and setting up what the benefits could be. Identify some of the barriers and the challenges. But as long as you go through the process of trying to overcome those barriers, that's the only way you're going to try and sort of facilitate reuse. That's sort of the experience I've had anyway.
From my side, mate, this is what you have to do. This is the most important thing you have to do, because if the mindset isn't right at the front end, it will be doomed. Any sort of reuse project will be doomed to have continual disruption, because people haven't bought into the fact it's the right thing to do. And in effect, if someone's questioning or challenging it, it's usually fear-based from some area. So there's either fear of change, fear of failure, fear of things taking too long. There's that. And if you can find out where that fear lies and talk about that and what that looks like, then you can really break down that and help move that shift along. And I think the important thing to do at that stage is recognize you probably will get it wrong. It probably will maybe cost you a bit much the first time and then less the second time, because you've learned. It could easily, I think there's a strive for perfection in both circularity and reuse. Reuse isn't easy. but it's so rewarding in so many ways. And it is actually an absolute imperative for us to do it for environmental and social reasons. But to do that mindset change, it's, as Jack said, it's, you have to set the aspirations high, and then you have to work on, okay, so tell me those reasons, let's break them down, and what sits behind that perception. And then if it's someone that's financially focused, you've got the cost savings you can talk about. You know, if they're environmentally persuaded, there's obviously the carbon and the social, and there's lots of different ones. But I dare say, May, you've probably met more barriers to reuse than anyone as well. So you've probably got something to add on that.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of said it with the data, to be honest. You know, everything is driven by commercial, and people use the excuse on the commercial element. But you know, the carbon is a big driver at the moment in construction because it has the highest carbon emitted, and it's quite complex, right? Carbon calculated from demolition is different from a refurb, so it's about understanding which part of the carbon is important to the client, and then kind of working backwards and going, well, is the value of you saving the carbon higher than that extra bit of money that you're putting in? And we find actually it takes somebody 3 times on our system before they get into their own rhythm on it. So as you said, the reuse aspect is the easy bit. It's about the technology and the enablement of that. And what's the beauty of it is people talk to each other. So contractors, you know, the beauty of the built environment is you have to work together because no one does everything, right? So that there's this element of referral. And I think a case study, as you said, I think Jack, it was, or you, and you were saying about do something, even if it costs you a lot at the beginning, you'll then understand for the next stage and it'll be cheaper and so on. So I think definitely that's the way to physically do it and put a business case together if it has to be signed off. And we're seeing a lot more cost surveyors getting involved and talking to us as well. So maybe some of the behavior change the cost surveyors can actually help drive that as well. I've got 2 questions here. One from, beg your pardon, sorry, Chris. One of the things for him in his role as a commercial analyst is measuring circularity and integrating it in both economic and environmental savings of asset reuse. Are there any recommendations on how best to measure this and how to integrate this in the world of construction? So this is the data side. How do you guys measure that type of data?
That's a very good question, actually. And I think one of the findings of Elliott Wood's sort of work is that at the moment, there's not enough information in terms of the resale value of existing materials, potentially because there's not really been much of an appetite for a secondary market. But, you know, the potential there is massive if a secondary sort of materials market can be established, which is one, you know, that's a key opportunity for the UK in terms of maximizing reuse. But that Elliott Wood study does say at the moment there's very little data about the resale value of existing materials. Now, hopefully, over the coming years, with the GLA's requirements in terms of the circular economy, you know, they are going to be gathering lots and lots of data in terms of existing materials. And you know, the requirements in terms of whole life carbon. You know, we're capturing more data. So with that data, hopefully, we'll get a bit more of an understanding of potentials for reuse. I think it's part of the Madasta program that the waste is just a material without an identity. So once you have that identity, you can do something with it. So hopefully over the coming years, you know, or within the next year or so, we'll have a bit more information, and you know, that should hopefully facilitate reuse.
Yeah, absolutely. And Doug's on the back of that, I'm interested to know what needs to happen for large developers to have reuse platforms like Globechain, thank you, Doug, on their books in their supply chains to better ensure reuse is genuinely explored and adopted. So what needs to happen for large developers to adopt these types of, I guess, the technologies, right? Not just us, these kind of new innovations that don't fit into the status quo, if you like, of the old traditional methods and procurements in built environment.
Like the only experience I have is from Grosvenor. So we do a lot of work with Grosvenor, and they are really keen on this idea about a secondary materials market. So that's why, you know, there was a bit of an innovation piece with this reuse project. And on other projects, they are trying to look at how they can reuse materials from their existing stock, within other portions, within other developments. So, for example, they've had, I was part of a scheme whereby they'd identified sort of a quantity of steel within another site, and they were going to look to reuse that in a different site. So I think as part of large developers' aspirations from potentially from sort of the net zero carbon side of things, they are trying to think a bit more on a portfolio level. So whether that that to me is the key opportunity for them, in terms of having the technology to monitor that. Hopefully, well, they'll need to start establishing those types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And Anne, have you got any thoughts on that?
Sorry, Meg, just repeat that because I couldn't hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you got any thoughts on kind of the technology side and how to get people engaged, especially developers?
I think, yeah, just to touch on the last question as well, I think part of the problem in all of this is what we've been measuring and reporting on for too long, because, when you look at all the different drivers, historically, how long have we been just talking about recycling rates? I mean, it's just, and tonnage avoided from landfill. I mean, it's, that kind of, that's not progressive. You can argue if you're not measuring reuse, the more you reuse, it might be that your recycling levels go down. So that's a disincentive in the first place. So the sooner we can change all the metrics, the better. Measuring circularity is difficult, and getting the data is difficult. But as you say, technology is a massive enabler for that. We do reports on our IT repair, refurbishment, and reuse, and our furniture. Using data that's already been established, because there's embodied carbon and what can be saved and what additionality is made from materials that are introduced. But actually, to get large organizations to adopt reuse in general, and to look at the sort of technology that you've got there, you need to tackle procurement, because there's all sorts of barriers in procurement to innovation. There's all sorts of barriers to circularity in how businesses are financed and how budgets are set. And these are all reasons not to. And, it's the aspirations are being set by the clients. People are setting their net zero carbon commitments, and the roadmaps are still very, very woolly. But the roadmaps will need them to have set defined goals about how they're going to achieve this. And their scope 3 emissions around the products that they use are going to play a big part in this. If you start to look at the large developers, how are you going to address these aspirations through your supply chain? Then you get down to the products and services you buy. Well, why is that being bought? Why are you encouraging additional embodied carbon? Why are you not reusing? And until they drill down to the how, then it's a no-brainer to engage in reuse. But unfortunately, you kind of need that bottom-up approach, people to look at what's going in skips and going, why? And look at a skip and not say that that's full of waste. Just look at the skip and say, look at the money that we're wasting. Yeah. So it's got to come from the top down, probably, because people do have to change their procurement practices. They do have to change how they evaluate and measure. But actually, I think everyone's got a responsibility to look at how they carry out a project. And if you want to be proud of something, you need to be looking at what you're throwing away and maybe put a value to the lost revenue from that.
Yeah, and what we see in the tender process now is like landlords and developers, they will put into the tender process specific wording to say you've got to find a reuse solution or a platform or something along those lines, that's come from their legal department and what they can write in tenders. And usually what happens then, specifically in our case, they will say speak to Globechain or speak to whoever to look at the services. Then we would engage the developer at that stage. And what you find is if the developer wants to win that contract, obviously they've got to tick the boxes of what that tender requirements. And that could be that differentiator compared to a contractor that maybe didn't do research on that specific point. So we're finding more and more like that. And then once they use it, they want to use it on others because they realize that it's a win-win for them, right? Because they've incorporated the cost in that tender process. Previously agreed. So we see it like that, actually, like not dictatorship. It's like we want you to do reuse, and the developer then has to add the costs to that if they wanted to, or work a way around it. Jack, from your perspective, you work with a lot of clients where you talk to them about reuse. Do they agree and go, oh, this is great? Do you think it's because they don't know the solutions out there because they're so busy as well? Or do you have to actually produce data for them when you're having that conversation to say to them, look, this is the commercial, or this is the data that you could receive from this that's very valuable for you?
Yeah, I think part of the barrier is the lack of knowing of some of the benefits. Sometimes it's just business as usual is to demolish and recycle. So unless you sort of get them out of that mode of thinking, they're just going to continue with the business as usual approach. So, for example, on one of our projects, at the sort of early stages, we looked at the potential for the potential savings that reuse would have from an embodied carbon perspective, and sort of drilling down into the numbers on that side of things really did make them think about is demolishing and starting again the right approach, and I think that's fed through then to other projects as well. So I think from the carbon side of things, yes, it is a case of trying to upskill them, make the clients aware of this problem, and reuse as a mechanism for sort of solving part of that problem. Additionally, we've had other clients where they didn't really think about the social benefits that partnership with a company like Globechain could have. So, for example, on some of our projects, we've just brought yourselves on board, just to sort of communicate with the client to see to tell them all the benefits really. And after that conversation, they've really been on board. They see that there's an environmental benefit, they see there's a social benefit, and the costs really are they significantly different for just a soft strip out. And I think I can't remember who said it earlier, but fundamentally in that case, the environmental and social benefits outweigh the economic costs to them as a client.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, I mean the obviously, since there's been a significant change or in profile of social value in the front end piece of procurement, where there's, the evaluation has just increased significantly, finding quantifiable ways to be able to demonstrate social value is a challenge. And obviously there, if you've got the data behind what you're doing, and that data can be translated into the sort of various forms of social value, improvement in air quality, carbon reduction, then it makes that kind of intangible part of social value much easier to try and translate. And that's a big challenge that people have got at the moment. Historically, we've not been, or businesses haven't been as challenged as much to be very specific about the social value they're delivering. But now you've got big contracts being set out and some really specific parameters. Some of it will be about employment and training and skills, but a lot of it will be about the carbon reduction. Anything on the sort of Build Back Better Build Back Better initiative will also want to know how a project is going to be mitigating, and quantifiables around reuse will be a massive contributor to those that have got big social value commitments in their supply chain.
Yeah, amazing. And time is flying by for this, so we'll probably wrap up in a couple minutes, but just kind of like your final thoughts on where we are in an industry. Where do you think is the next step to go in this kind of implementing reuse? Because as you said, the last kind of couple of years has been very much white papers and theory, and now people are actually implementing it. So what would you say the biggest things that you can see for the next year going forwards that people need to kind of overcome, or just like, as you said, just take that risk and try it?
From my side, certainly it's try it, try to do it. We know what the benefits are, and if and just go through the options. If there's a cost associated with doing something, make the quantity, get the quantity surveyor on board, the cost consultant, appraise those options from a cost perspective. And if it's too costly for the client, they're not going to bear those costs. But if there's something to gain, then that's a benefit. You don't have to reuse everything, but you could reuse something, and I think that's better than not.
Yeah, absolutely.
And from my perspective, I think there's sort of two themes really, May. One is, it's very often easy to say these are reasons why not, but I think the alternative of not acting isn't there anymore. Every business is being evaluated against its performance in one way or the other. There'll always be people that operate at the bottom end, and that's fine. I'm not wasting any energy with those, but You know, it's not a reason not to, it's the reason, you know, why. Tell me your reason for staying the same. Tell me your reason for inactivity, because it's got to be pretty strong not to engage with this agenda. And secondly, it would be lovely, and I know it's probably maybe a bit of wishful thinking, is more open transparency, collaboration and sharing. You know, we did this project, this went well, this didn't. You know, this is how we carried it out. This is what, you know, this is how. I realise there's competition out there, but this shouldn't be the competitive piece. This should be the business as usual. This should be like health and safety, and your other the competitive advantages the business have. This, it may sit as part of that initially, but that should sit about how, you know, what you're doing. The how you do it should be the best practice across the industry, and you'll only get that if everyone can be more collaborative.
Absolutely, yeah. No, thank you both for that. So I've got down, just to summarize our process flow, if you like. It starts off with aspirations, as Jack mentioned, you know, like what do you want to achieve from it? Second is obviously put some implementation and get the right people together and be honest and transparent. And then start with a commercial trial, even be prepared if you think it's going to be more expensive, just test it, even if it's on some basic principles, and then take the next leap of faith, obviously, and test it again is the best way. And at each of those stages, you've really got to fine tune probably the marketing and the comms of that. And enablers probably is the GLA, the reports, the pre-demolition audits, the must-haves going forwards, and that's obviously going to continue. And the challenges is really behaviour change and engagement with people that are still in, I suppose, old procurement setups. Procurement's going to take a while, but, you know, there are people out there that will, you know, go that extra mile and help on procurement, you know, because it's not in the right cost center or it's not being allocated a budget. So those are the, you're right, we're seeing probably more procurement problems because innovation doesn't fit into the classic tick box on the liabilities and things, especially technology. So yeah, it's on that side. So yeah, I hope that was very engaging for the audience. Obviously, feel free to reach out to Jack and Anne. They've got a lot of knowledge on this and have done so many things with us and many people. So Anne and Jack, thank you so much for your time and advice today. And I hope everybody enjoyed that, and we've recorded it, so we'll send out the link if anyone's missed it or you want to forward it on. But have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See you later. Take care.
Yes,
Bye.
thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.